From Judge Juan Merchan today. Meg Kennard, our friend there at the Associated Press, has it that the judge has ordered President-elect Donald Trump to be sentenced on January 10th in the New York hush money case. Well, our colleague at Fox 5 New York, Jessica Formoso, has more. Okay, looks like we don't have any audio on that, and we do apologize here. But in the meantime, we do want to bring into the conversation some of our legal analysts and friends who we rely on so much to help us make sense of what Judge Juan Merchan did today. That's, of course, legal analyst, former federal prosecutor Neama Rahmani. He joins us. Neama, good to see you here. So we apologize about that audio there in that report, but let's get right to it. So I want to bring this up because the original sentencing date was July 11th of last year. Then it was moved to September 18th of last year. Then it was indefinitely postponed, and this was kind of in between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Now Judge Merchan issuing this ruling today, not dismissing the case, but setting a new date of January the 10th. How would you characterize this? What is he doing here?
Well, I'm surprised in terms of how Judge Juan Merchan has handled the timing of it all. Some of it, of course, is Donald Trump's own doing because he, of course, asked for the sentencing to be delayed until after the November general election. But we're talking about a conviction that happened in May 30th, I believe, of last year. Now, all of a sudden, about 10 days before the inauguration and 1 week, we get a Friday afternoon late notification that Donald Trump is going to be sentenced a week from today on Friday. Now, we can expect that sentence to be an unconditional discharge, which is essentially no substantive sentence at all. So we're talking about no period of incarceration, which was unlikely in any event, no home confinement, no probation, not even a fine. But it's still important because under most states' laws, including New York, that felony conviction isn't final until there's that judgment of conviction, that sentence. And of course, Trump will appeal that conviction to the New York Supreme Court Appellate Division, then the New York Court of Appeal, which is their version of the Supreme Court, then, of course, to the United States Supreme Court. But now that process is going to have to start within the next week. And I'm sure Trump is going to try to get the appellate courts in New York to step in and stop next week's sentencing. But if he's unsuccessful, he will be indeed a convicted felon.
Yeah, and some of our producers who have followed this so closely, they remind us that Trump does have the option to appear in person or virtually for this. But from page 17 of this order, Neama, Judge Merchan writes he is not inclined to sentence Trump to prison. He also rejected DA Bragg's suggestion that he preserve the verdict, but end proceedings as it would deny Trump's right to a path for appeal here. So it does seem like Judge Juan Merchan is leaving the door open for the appellate process for Trump and his attorneys here. But let's go into that. The likely sentence would be an unconditional discharge here. What does that mean?
So the district attorney took a few different positions. Obviously, they argued against the defense motions to have the case dismissed. They said that one or two things should potentially happen. The case should be held in abeyance, which means basically put on hold until Trump is out of office. But that would mean 2029. Judge Juan Merchan said, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Then there's the possibility of essentially terminating the case. That's something that rarely happens. Essentially, if a criminal defendant dies, the case has to stop. But again, obviously, Trump is president-elect. He's not dead, so that doesn't make sense. So really, the judge had to rule on the substantive motions, which I'm sure we'll talk about, because there are going to be issues on appeal. The first, of course, being presidential immunity. The second, which is a newer argument, is that because Trump is now president-elect and soon to be president, the sentence would interfere with the performance of his duties. That's more of a separation of powers or a supremacy clause issue. But really, Andrew, we've been talking about this case for months, really years, and the writing was on the wall that Donald Trump was not going to receive any sentence, substantive sentence in this case. We talked about the gag order and his violations and Trump not being held in contempt. So really just the question was Judge Juan Merchan finally going to rule on these motions and really start that appellate process? And it seems like indeed he has. And that conviction will be final, and we'll see Trump litigate this through the courts of appeal. The story is far from over.
So, Nima, what about in an unconditional discharge? So, be not a punitive penalty as far as jail time is concerned. What about a fine? He did have to pay fines for violating gag orders many times during the course of the trial. What about a fine here for the penalty?
I thought the fine was the most likely outcome in this case. I never thought confinement would be an issue. Same thing with probation, either formal or informal. Does not make sense to put a former president, especially a president elect, on probation. I think Judge Juan Merchan's concern was probably, well, if I impose a fine and Trump doesn't pay the fine, what am I going to do? Am I going to take him into custody? So just to avoid any continuing jurisdiction or potential issues in this case, the judge said, look, I'm just going to be done with it. There will be a conviction. Trump will appeal the conviction, but there's going to be no penalty. And, if you're talking about the seriousness of this case, and we've spent a lot of time talking about it, obviously, Donald Trump has no previous criminal history. We're talking about Class E felonies, which are the least serious under New York law. There was a good legal argument that really these should have been misdemeanors. Any false business records in furtherance of or to cover up another crime can be felonies, but that argument was a bit of a legal stretch. So, of all the criminal cases that Donald Trump faced, and obviously they've all gone away almost entirely because now he's president elect, this was by far and away the least serious. So, there was never real possibility of incarceration for him, despite some of his opponents asking for it.
Okay, so Nima, I want to ask somewhat of a political question, but there is a legal answer I think that you could provide here. For many of Trump's opponents, it matters to them that they can call him a convicted felon. So help us explain why in this scenario they can still, if the sentence is handed down, they can still call him that.
He still is indeed a convicted felon. The sentence has nothing to do with the felony conviction. Someone can receive a sentence of life in prison or no sentence at all, and the felony conviction remains. So, obviously, when someone is a convicted felon, it can have legal implications, one of which is not the ability to serve as president. There's no impediment to being president because you have a felony conviction. That's not something that's required by the Constitution. Now, obviously, Trump cares a lot about that stigma, and he will appeal this conviction, and he will go through the various process, and he has some arguments on appeal. We've seen him have some success in his other cases. Of course, presidential immunity, we spent a lot of time talking about it, even though the conduct there wasn't necessarily official acts, but we recall the Supreme Court's presidential immunity opinion being very broad,
Sure.
and even evidence of official acts can't come in. So Trump's argument will be on appeal that his communications with communications director Hope Hicks and operations director Madeline Weisenhart, those communications, as well as his tweets about Michael Cohen, those were evidence of official acts that shouldn't have come into the trial, which of course would require its reversal.
So the judge here did not dismiss the case, meaning the conviction is essentially upheld. But I was saying in that limbo, in that purgatory where no sentence was going to be handed down until possibly after Trump left office in January of 2029, many of his detractors and opponents and legal analysts like yourself told me that you could not call Trump a convicted felon if a sentence was not handed down. And it seems like that's not going to be the case here. The sentence of unconditional discharge, yes, imposes no practical penalty. It is still a sentence.
That is correct, Andrew. In most states like New York, until that conviction is entered, there's that judgment of conviction, one is not a convicted felon. And we talked about criminal defendants who died. Probably a recent case that maybe some folks followed was Bob Durst, who was the subject of the HBO documentary, The Jinx. He killed 3 people over the span of decades. Finally, in Los Angeles, decades later, he was convicted and brought to justice, but because he died following the jury verdict, but before that sentence was imposed, he is not a convicted felon. That judgment has to be entered. So everyone's been calling Trump a felon, but he is not a felon for the purposes of the law until he is sentenced next week. So again, it's a legal distinction. Maybe the lawyers care about it or some of the
Yeah.
folks who are watching, but it is certainly an important distinction.
Yeah, we are getting into some of these legal technicalities here. Let's kind of bring it back to the fore. Neama, just lastly, what happens on January 10th for President-elect Trump, do you think?
So one of two things will happen. The appellate division of the Supreme Court is going to intervene. And let's not forget, Trump has had some success before the appellate courts in New York. Not necessarily in this case as much as the Letitia James civil fraud case. Trump went to the appellate courts. He had his bond amount on appeal reduced significantly. The defense was able to get Ivanka dismissed from that case. So there's the possibility in the next week that the appellate courts in New York step in and stop this sentencing. But if not, we know what Judge Juan Merchan's sentence is going to be. It's going to be that unconditional discharge. Essentially, Trump will be a felon. There will be no sentence, and the appellate process will begin. It'll take months, just like any other appeal. Again, unless the appellate courts decide to fast track it there.
Okay, so but in 10 days from that date, he'll be sworn in as president for a second time. Will there be any conditions placed on him?
I don't think so. I think
Okay.
it's so impractical to
I see.
impose conditions on a president. And I think Judge Juan Merchan knows that and sees that and is just going to finalize this conviction and let that appeals process start.
All right, Neama Rahmani, as always, thank you for helping us make sense of this. And Happy New Year. I'm sure we'll be talking a lot in 2025. Neama, thanks so much.
Thanks, Andrew. Happy New Year. I'm sure we'll be talking next week about this.